the biggest single change, and it has affected every one of the 84 recognized accrediting organizations in the US, is of course the shift to virtual. Over time, it took several months, that affected every facet of the work of the accrediting organization. Self-studies were submitted virtually. Peer review became totally virtual. You would have discussions, conferences, meetings with colleagues on campuses. Instead of sitting down with them or attending a class, you would do it like we are on Zoom. The decision-making bodies of the accrediting organizations, the commissions or councils or boards, they're called all of those things in different organizations, also met virtually. And the staff of the accrediting organizations, for the most part, worked virtually as well. So we are all by now, Gerardo, familiar with how we have had to adjust our communication with each other because we've been doing it like this now for at least a year. That is the biggest single impact, and it's on accreditation practice. If we look at, well, what were the accreditors examining? The institutions and the programs, it changed in that it was a mix of remote and in person, but the remote piece of that, as we know, grew enormously. So even though all the accreditors had standards for distance learning, they almost all examined distance learning, they were familiar with it. The sheer extent of it, how much of the work was online, forced them, and I think this is a very positive thing, to relook at their standards, think about their practices, reflect on the judgments they were making. And for the accreditors, that was not easy, having talked with many of them, because even though there's a lot of value and you learn a lot in this kind of situation, you and I chatting versus sitting down together around a table, you still have this sense some of the time, I don't really know what's going on. I'm not on the campus. I can't meet people casually. I can't drop in the cafeteria, for example. So there was an ongoing sense of, do we know enough to make the judgment about quality? And then, if I may, there were two other circumstances that were not driven by the pandemic, but emerged during the pandemic. And one of them, of course, is the range of equity issues going back to last spring, and especially around race. And for the accreditors, this is ongoing, a fresh look at how any standards they might have related to equity, related to social justice, racial justice, how those standards are effective or not in an environment where we have really, really intensified our focus on equity issues. You and I both know there have been conversations for many years in higher education that minority students don't do as well. Minority students are not particularly well represented in more elite institutions. Minority students, some people think, aren't given the same opportunities when it comes to admissions, etc. And all of that became much more intense. So accreditors that didn't have any standards that focused on these areas began addressing them, and accreditors that did, and I don't know the breakout, had to take another look at, are we doing enough here? Is attention to equity and social justice adequately represented in the work that we do? Very important issue. And then the second coincident thing had to do with something that's been growing for a number of years, as you and I both know, and that is the role of especially the baccalaureate, and how valuable it is, what is the cost benefit analysis, and all this attention to workforce, career education. But this time that's been around for a long time, but this time it was focused on, look, I may get a credential, I may have some courses, I can get a certificate, a badge, whatever, and that will be just as valuable to me for my economic future as a baccalaureate degree. And that was coming up at the same time, and that's still with us. I think, by the way, that all of these things will remain with us after COVID, but the attention to virtual practice, virtual driven practice, the greater attention to distance learning, the equity issue, and the workforce and sub-baccalaureate credentialing. Those are the major things. I think there's several things. I think they've been around for a while. I don't think this is pandemic influenced at all. But first, I think that we are a model of how a quality assurance enterprise, I hesitate to say system in the US, because as you know, there are 84 accreditors and they're all independent, all right? But that we could operate as a civil society force. We're independent from government. Now, it gets very complex very quickly because of the role we play with government, but the notion that civil society, not government, can have established and maintained. We've got one of the oldest, if not the oldest, quality assurance systems in the world. I think people have always looked at that. As I've traveled the world these years, and I would love to get back to traveling the world, they've always kind of said, wow, you maintain this in the absence of it being established and directed by government. And it's not that we want other people to do that. It's that they look at it and they are intrigued by it. And while we're talking, I can think of so many times sitting in the CHIA conference room where, well, what do you mean the government doesn't make the final decision about degrees? Institutions do. What do you mean admission to a college is dependent on the college or university, not the government? But that kind of conversation, it really has been fascinating. A second thing is our particular take on institutional autonomy and academic freedom. Those issues are paramount around the world. There's no question about it, or at least we all talk about them, a good deal of the time. But our particular take in the US, where institutional autonomy is very much a part of the history of higher education, which did not emerge originally, as we know, from government. It emerged privately in New England. And our particular approach to academic freedom, where that too reflects in its origins a certain independence of government. There are a lot of nuances here, but people, I think that and how we do it is important. And finally, this is true for some countries, Gerardo, but not all, our emphasis on formative evaluation. There are a number of countries where review of quality in higher education institutions is very much what's the bottom line. US has always resisted that. Sometimes that hasn't been, in my opinion, a good thing, but we have. But our particular brand of formative evaluation. So none of these things are unique, but we have a particular approach based on our history and our culture. And look, quality assurance bodies around the world all started as country-based. And we reflect that as well. So those are the three things I would point to. I think it's vitally important that we in the US always approach engagement internationally as a colleague, in a collegial way, as a partner. There is a tendency, because of the history of the role of the United States and because we've had so much experience with quality assurance, for some folks on our side of the Atlantic to say, oh, we're going to show you. I don't think that works very well personally. And also for people from other countries, and as you know, quality assurance is a relatively recent phenomenon. And in a number of countries, if we go back 25 years, maybe, well, fewer than half the countries had a fully developed quality assurance capacity, and now almost every country has one. So it's very important to stress, in my view, the partnership, the collegiality. The United States should not be accreditation imperialists. I think that's critical. So in that spirit, what have we learned? What are some of the practices in other countries? I think first and foremost, the inclusion of students, the extent to which students are included on teams in deliberations with regard to what is quality in a higher education institution. And that is stronger in some parts of the world than others, but nonetheless very important. And to this day, we talk to students, we engage students in accreditation in the US, but not nearly to the extent, for example, that Europe does. And I think there's a lot to learn there. We've emulated that a little bit. I think we would benefit from doing more with it. I think a second factor here has been the centrality of multinational organizations, UNESCO, OECD, the World Bank, in the work and the development of quality assurance in a variety of countries. I mean, we could argue, absent those multinational bodies providing financial support, being thought leaders in quality assurance, it would have been much, much harder for a number of countries to develop quality assurance. And those places have been arenas of conversation for the US as well. And they've been major sites of learning and meeting and communication. And although we participate in all those organizations to some extent and we're financially involved in them, one of the things I've seen over the years is the level of engagement and dependence of colleagues in so many other countries in multinational organizations and the very positive role that they play. A third area, I think, from which we can learn is the extent to which there has been emphasis around the world, coming from particularly Europe initially, of expanding beyond the national. I'm thinking the European Union, the European standards and guidelines. I'm thinking of EU Share, where the European Union's gone into Southeast Asia. I'm thinking of the work of the European Union in Africa and all that's being developed there. If you look at the cooperative efforts in Latin America, if you look at, the International Network for Quality Assurance Agencies in Higher Education that spawned all these regional networks, the Asia Pacific Network has been a major leader of ideas and practices. The US, one, in some ways, because we have states and we're a country, people see us as operating in an international mode. Of course, it's not international. And people, and of course, the US has operated, US accrediting organizations operated internationally for a good number of years. more than 50 of the recognized accreditors are accrediting either US or non-US operations, institutions, or programs in other countries. So we've taken that international path, all right, which has been different from the other countries. So when we look at, for example, what Europe has done or what has happened in Asia, there's a lot to learn there about partnership. So the emphasis on students, the role of multinational organizations, and expanding beyond the national. Something else I might have mentioned is the European Quality Assurance Register is a good example of what I'm talking about. Let me preface what I'm going to say by stating that I care passionately about the independence of accreditation, and I care passionately about the independence and self-determination of higher education itself. I care more passionately than a number of people do about that. So that's going to influence what I say. I think that one of the major things I've noticed over the years is that, look, politics plays a role in accreditation. Yes, we are non-governmental bodies, but because of the connection between accreditation and student financial aid and eligibility for other federal funds and similar things at the state level, states authorized institutions, states approved programs, a certain amount of what happens with government influences higher education and in different and accreditation, but in different ways. We just came through the last administration where there was not a lot of emphasis on regulation of accreditation. Well, the administration before that, and I'm talking about the Trump administration, and now I'm going back to the Obama administration, there was a great deal of concern to monitor and control accreditation. So one of the issues is be prepared for changes based on elections, based on who is in power, because they're very different approaches to higher education here in the US between the Democrats and the Republicans. If there's a lesson for that, it is that government will play a powerful role. The role just varies. So I think that we have to be very alert, Gerard, about protecting what works best in US accreditation. And in my view, what works best is our independence, is our formative evaluation, and primary emphasis on quality improvement, our powerful commitment to preserving institutional autonomy and academic freedom. And yeah, we can have all that, but at the same time, we have to be guardians of those features because the government manages through regulation. And what we've seen over the years, I mean, I could argue, is a diminishing of just hold us accountable to managing what accreditation is doing. And whether Republican or Democrat, I think you see an increase going through over the years. So watch about government control, protect what works best and what we know is most important to colleges and universities and students. Quality improvement, formative evaluation, academic freedom, institutional autonomy. Those are the major lessons. And politics influence what happens. That's the name of the game. We're not out there on some island and we don't have to worry. We got to worry that if one looks over the past 20, 25 years, there has been a clear theme of growing federal support for higher education. You can talk about free college, nothing's free, but it means taxpayers are going to pay more than they're already paying, which is considerable. When you talk about debt relief, I think we're making our way slowly but surely to totally subsidize, federally subsidized undergraduate education. And I think it's going to take a while longer. Policy development is neither rational nor purposeful in the sense that the end goal is realized immediately. It happens by fits and starts. So I wanted to say that by way of preface. You know, people for years have talked about, oh, higher education is going to become like K-12. In this sense, yes. I mean, I can say more about that, but I won't. So what does that mean? There's no such thing as free money. If higher education subsidy is going to significantly increase funding from the government, that means the other issue we were talking about, government control, is going to increase as well. And I think you see that in this country, Kenley, the difference between Democrats and Republicans. It's the Democrats who are really, really pushing for, we need to cancel student debt, free college. And they are the same party that is particularly interested in additional authority control over higher education. I think also that this emphasis from the federal level is part of a broader issue. I think the country's shifting where in a lot of ways we're re-examining federalism. We're re-examining being a republic. And that means that we are less and less comfortable. What's happened with COVID is a good example with, oh, the states make these decisions, the federal government doesn't make these decisions. And I think there's going to be a lot of holdover from COVID with regard to some of these issues. So as the federal government plays a larger and larger role and may even get to the role of providing operating support for institutions, which the states do now for public institutions, I think state authority is going to diminish or play a somewhat different role. And I think that's important. I mean, there are a lot of issues around the more you centralize authority, raises a whole lot of questions, and we can look at some, not US, but other countries' examples where more and more authority has been centralized and we're not comfortable with it. So this is a development. We'll see what happens. Another issue for accreditation is the trust issue. There's evidence, as you know, of a decline in public confidence in higher education and accreditation. And as Martin Troe from Berkeley used to say, trust goes down, accountability goes up. And I think that's part of what's going on as well. So more money means more control. More control affects accreditation as well as higher education. It's partly fueled by some decline in trust, and that trust also embeds a sense from a lot of people, public politicians, not all, higher education isn't doing its job. And we can all talk about graduation rates, and we can talk about retention and attrition rates, and we can talk about employment, but the country is becoming more and more impatient. We've got this massive enterprise, what, 650, $700 billion a year, and we're not getting everything the country needs from it. So I really do think that all these discussions about free college, et cetera, are part of this larger picture of a major shift in our attitude toward higher education and its quality generally. Major feature of US accreditation that is a strength, but can become a liability is how deliberate we are. Change in accreditation is slow. Now, on the one hand, We're in the conserving business. We want to be very careful about change. On the other hand, there is a lot of hesitation, in my opinion, about really confronting things like digital credentials, things like alternative providers, non-traditional, to use an old phrase, institutions, and embracing them in order to explore, are they viable higher education options that will serve students well? If you have a company offering a baccalaureate degree, look what's happening with Coursera and the other originally MOOCs in terms of certification, for example, and accreditation in general has been reluctant to embrace alternative providers and alternative practices. We get there. We always get there, but sometimes, not sometimes, I've often thought over the years, it takes us too much time. We're not as invested in anticipating. And I think that I've seen the same things in some other countries, but I don't want to be critical about that. I do think that's playing out a bit with both remote learning and the workforce issue. With regard to remote learning, before COVID, oh yeah, it was there, but it was in some ways a kind of second-class citizen, with a few exceptions. Now, in a way, it's been mainstream, and that's really good for accreditation, because accreditation is forced to examine this more and to be more reflective about standards and practices. I think that workforce and alternative credentialing, digital credentials, but also the sub-degree level, is another area where there's been a lot of hesitancy, backed by, oh, well, we stand for certain values that are endemic to traditional higher education. I share those values. I come from traditional higher education. I value it highly, but we've been slower on these other issues. So we have to be on the lookout for how deliberate we are, our commitment to the pace of change. And the other thing I think we have to worry about is just accepting the extent to which others control our destiny. And part of that is government, part of that is circumstance. But I think we can be better guardians of our self-determination and independence. And as I talked about earlier, the importance of quality improvement, all right, and the values that undergird accreditation. I think we can be fiercer, if you will, guardians. But those are just a couple things. Let me mention one other thing. All the emphasis right now, not only on social justice issues, but also on the well-being of students, social issues, hunger, mental health, all those things are vitally important. We're tending to them at institutions, and therefore accreditation needs to pay attention to them. But I don't want us to lose our academic focus. And I worry about that. That's just me worrying that we were invented around academic competence, academic effectiveness, the success of students academically. And while I know it's important to address these other issues, I wouldn't want accreditation or higher education to pay less and less attention to those other issues. And I do think I see that happening. For example, when I read Inside Higher Ed, or I read the Chronicle of Higher Ed every day, we don't talk about academic issues in those trade publications nearly as much as we used to. And I wonder where we're headed, if you will, that the core feature of higher education is intellectual development, not to the exclusion of these other issues, but I don't want us to lose that.
I think that's absolutely insightful. And what a great way to kind of bring together these different themes in the conversation. I'm just going to rant now, so I should stop the